This is really a celebration of the future of agriculture, and that's what our speakers will be talking about today. We have Peter Tredici. He's a botanist, specializing in the growth and development of trees. He retired from the Arnold Arboretum of Harvard University in 2014 after working there for 35 years. Since then, his research has focused on urban ecology and climate change. And he published a widely acclaimed book, Wild Urban Plants of the Northeast, a field guide. We do have 4 copies of that here. And then we have Ridgway Farm represented here by Gordon and Ian, and that of course is an organic farm in Cornwall using heritage techniques to produce their goods. So who wants to start? I think Ian, you start? Okay, great, thank you.
All right, welcome everybody. We're going to talk about apples and history. So naturally, we're going to do a bit of a book talk because we're in the library. So these are 3 books that I think can sort of tell a really good story. We're going to start with American Cider, written by 2 people. Greg lives in Rhinebeck and has a really good grocery store. If you guys are inspired by cider, it's worth the drive. Go to Russet Cafe. And then John Bunker is the man who brought us these trees. He's definitely an apple icon, and Andy Brennan is how I started my apple journey. We'll get into those. So the way he laid out the book, it followed the colonizers of the U.S. here. I'm going to focus on New England, and apples followed New Englanders as we settled this area. As we all know, New England's very hilly and rocky, so they had to improvise a little bit. They could not follow the Virginia model of having large swaths, having plantations, and having big monocrop agriculture. Instead, it tied in nicely because there are Puritans here who are really striving for self-sufficiency. So they would have homestead orchards and gardens just to survive here. We're talking late 1600s, early 1700s. And to make a lot of these orchards, what they would do is they would just spread apple seeds around, sort of Johnny Appleseed style. But what that does, we'll get into the genetics of apple seeds and apple trees. Because if you plant a seed from an apple, it'll be different than whatever tree you planted it from, because the genetics are influenced by whatever pollinated that flower and by its parentage. So as they're planting these seeds, they're creating a whole bunch of varieties that are hyper-localized to the area, because each seed is going to be its own variety. So as they were getting into that, they were planting these seeds, and a lot of the apples were really bitter, but that was fine because what they were doing was making cider. And the cider was a huge part of their survival because they did not have reliable wells. Even the dairy and the milk wasn't reliable. So having this fermented drink that they could make really easily was super vital to their survival here. So what you saw developing as orchards were growing and the community was growing, some of these places would even have community cider mills, as shown up here with the horse-drawn mill. So somewhere in the community, you know, someone would own it, but they would rent it out to farmers. So a farmer could bring his horse and his apples, and they could press the apples and make the cider in their barrels and bring it back home. And it was the cider commodity was it was not like a sellable product. I mean, they could sell it, but everyone was making it and they were relying on it. So that was sort of the purpose of them making cider. And then as we fast forward and slowly like the communities grow, they start to realize they can make some money farming. So they get into grafting and start planting known varieties and orchards. So buying up more land, and they can make some money selling these apples. And even those varieties, a lot of them were pretty localized to states and regions, but they were taking over the market pretty well. And through that, especially in areas like this, really rural areas, they would rely and they'd hire stagecoach drivers to get to like New York City or Boston or areas where they're not growing as much. So through that, a lot of taverns developed, and actually the state of Massachusetts made it a law that every town had to have a tavern in it, because on Sundays you'd have a morning sermon, a break, and an afternoon sermon. So they needed somewhere to go and somewhere to eat, so they'd have taverns, which was great. It was a place for people to talk and gossip, talk about the politics, and they were drinking cider and they were enjoying it. But then the railroads came in and it became a lot harder to compete on sort of that global scale. A lot of younger generations were moving west and looking for places where they could grow things other than rocks, like we like to do here, and find more fertile land. So there was a shift, and then they started to compete on a global scale with the railroads and the shipping. But that also helped to bring in more varieties, so they could start bringing in European varieties and other types of apples. But slowly, and I would say like late 1800s, there was a really tough competitive market, and they were driven by some of the consumer demand and just the demands of the markets to get less or like more specific varieties. Rather than having 40 varieties, it'd shift maybe to 10 varieties. So you get away from that really hyper-localized type of agriculture and type of apples. And then through that, then Prohibition happens. And when Prohibition happened, one of the things the government could do to handle the production of alcohol easily was starting to cut down orchards, because with beer it's a lot harder to do, and other like rum out of the Caribbean is like harder to do, but they could come in and they actually did that. They cut down thousands of apple trees, and then post-Prohibition until pretty recently, cider's been out of the modern, or just the consumer aren't really thinking about cider. So that is super interesting to me anyway. That's a brief overview of the apple and cider history of New England. Flash forward to modern day, there's this guy named John Bunker, who for the last 50 years in Maine has been working to try to identify some of these varieties that were grown 100, 200 years ago, that the only place you can find them is in an old nursery catalog. And Maine is a super abundant place for apples, and it's a little bit similar to here. You said something that's beautiful about Cornwall and about Maine is it never had that mass development that would wipe out some of these old varieties. And in Maine especially, apples are sort of grown or developed into the understory, so there's a lot of genetic material there. And he's done an amazing job about finding old varieties and bringing them back. He started Fedco in Maine, so people like me can buy these varieties once he grafts them out and gets them going. He's a super awesome guy. He calls himself the Sherlock Holmes of Maine apples. And what I can do and what we've done is when I find an old tree and say, this apple's cool, what do you think it is? Put it in the mail, send it up to him. And he's like, oh, I've seen that, that's a ball. Oh, I don't know what that one is. He said it's like listening to music. If you listen to the same music, like 3 seconds, you know exactly what song it is. He's like that with apples, it's incredible. He also has these really cool haunted signs. I just really like a lot. So he's an icon. Yeah, and he made all these trees too, which Peter will talk about. So in 2019, I was back here after college and trying to find a path, and my dad bought me this book, Uncultivated. This guy, Andy Brennan, is in the Southern Catskills in New York, and he has a cidery, but it's all about foraging apples and using wild fruit. So what's really cool about cider is like anywhere you look, you can find a different way to do it. And what he's doing, if you rewind to just fermenting apples or fermentation in general, you need yeast and you need sugar. The thing that's really cool about apples, obviously they have sugar, but their skin will collect the yeast ambient in the air. So all you need to make cider is apples and a press, and you can press it, you have juice, and it will ferment. And a lot of the commercial people now aren't going to do that because they can be more variable. You're relying on an unknown yeast strand and there can be some funk. But if you're crazy like me, you can grow to really like the funk and it's kind of cool. And that's also what they were doing. If we go back a couple of slides, like they weren't buying in some champagne yeast or whatever. They were just grinding apples and putting them in a barrel and making cider. So through this, he has this diagram here. If you want, we'll go through just the general process of cider making. Does this not show up on there? Does it?
It was, you go to the right.
I'll just go over here. I'll just point it out. All right. So you obviously, you have your orchard, you pick your apples. You bring them into a cold storage so you get enough when you're ready. You have your little grinder and you press them up. And then for cider, there's 2 stages of fermentation. So when you start out, you want to get that yeast going. So you want it to be around 65 degrees so the yeast starts to consume those sugars. But you don't want it to do that for too long because if it keeps on going, it will consume all the sugars and it can turn into vinegar. So then they have this process called cold crashing. So either you control the environment, or if you're in a place where you can cool it down to 35, or you move the cider into an environment like that to another barrel. So the yeast will still be going, but it'll be going much more gradually, and it will start to develop some really nice flavors. And then through that, you can put it in a barrel, or you just sort of store it for a couple months. You can store it, you only need like a couple months to make cider, but you really do taste the difference if you let it sit for 6 months or a year. It starts to get some nice complexity. So that's what all those barrels are doing. And then he pumps it up, and then we have a little bottle filler so he can fill his bottles, puts a cork in it, and he's off to go. So it's not rocket science, which is why I'm doing it. But all these books are awesome. This guy is really, I kind of think he's like a unicorn a little bit because he's just off doing his thing. And the thing to get into him a little bit more, so I said he uses wild fruit and forages fruit. So what that means is instead of just planting an orchard and saying, these are the types of apples I want, and I have this land, which that's what he wanted to do, but then he realized his soil wasn't really great for that. Instead, he would go around these roadsides and like find trees that maybe a deer like just consumed a seed and plopped out, or maybe there's an orchard that 50 years ago was in production, but now it's just in a cow pasture. You'd find all the fruit that way, and he would make a really fun cider. And the thing that they call them spitters, these apples that are so sour and so acidic and really tannic, all you can do if you eat them is spit them out because they're really like gross. But all of that acidity and tannins, when you ferment it, it makes a really nice cider. So I think it's cool if you can tell. This is a map I got from ciderguide.com that shows how abundant cider has become, which I obviously think is really awesome. You can see in the Hudson Valley there's a large percentage of places, which makes sense. New York State grows the second most amount of apples in the nation. And then Massachusetts, all over, even Connecticut's starting to pop up with more, which is cool. Talk a little bit about what I'm doing. So the first picture, I planted an orchard. We have 4 acres fenced in. I have over 500 fruit trees in the ground now, and a lot of these varieties are varieties that have been around for a long time. Some of what I'm doing in that middle picture is what Andy's doing in finding these old wild trees that are definitely spitters and just collecting apples off of those. The bottom 2 pictures, the trees in Antiquities and Fedco. That's where I'm sourcing my trees from, but I also, the bottom right, I'm grafting some too. So there's some trees around town that if they look big and fun enough, then I'll take a piece of wood and I'll graft that. So some of the varieties I know what they are, some of them I don't know, some of them just have a good story. But that's what I'm doing. And then the top two pictures are my cider press, and yeah, me making cider. That's what I got.
Okay. Anyway, thank you all for coming. I see a lot of people here that have supported us. What? Well, supported us along the way. Anyway, so there's connection. This is like a Cornwall story that I didn't know all the pieces of last year, 2 years ago when we started doing this. And thank to everybody for their support, their information, their guidance. We've met a lot of interesting people, heard a lot of interesting stories, some of which we'll try to relay to you. And a lot of it has to go back to the various early days of Cornwall and uncovering the story, in addition to covering the apple varieties and the people that were involved, has been really interesting because a lot of their relatives are here in the audience today. Right here, we've been a little bit on a Revolutionary War tangent this month. And here's Cornwall's own Ethan Allen demanding the surrender of Fort Ticonderoga in the name of the Great Jehovah and the Continental Congress. So what does that have to do with apples? Well, Ethan was born in Litchfield. His family lived in North Cornwall, in the field just south of North Cornwall Church, before he moved to Vermont, and with his brothers founded the Green Mountain Boys. And so 250 years ago this week, he met with officers of the Connecticut militia in a tavern in northern Massachusetts, and plotted why don't we take Fort Ticonderoga? Well, guess what? They happened to enjoy Great Apple's hard cider while they were making their plans. So there's all this tie-in. It's not accidental that was the drink of choice in the taverns at the time, and is still regarded as the drink of the Green Mountain Boys in Vermont today. So it gave them a certain amount of energy, so there's all these ties into these people. So less well known is his cousin Elijah Allen. So the Allens were the first settlers up in North Cornwall, around the North Cornwall Church area. Our farm was owned by Ethan Allen's uncle originally, and his son was Elijah Allen, who would be Ethan's brother. And Michael Gannett transcribed a report by Elijah Allen, wrote in 1800, which was the first survey of what life was like in Cornwall in 1800, and it was far different than it is right now. The population was almost the same. But when I read this, a couple things stand out, not just that they produced 20,000 pounds of flax, that's a lot of flax, but they also produced 1,555 barrels of cider. So that sounds like a lot of cider. That's 60,000 gallons of cider for a population of 1,500. So that's a lot of cider. But that is only the New England average, because I just read last night, Sturbridge Village said that that in all the towns in New England, the average was 40 gallons of cider produced per resident. So it's almost the exact amount. So that seems like an incredible amount of cider to be producing, especially the town was founded 60 years before. So how do you, I mean, Jim March is here, used to run Ellsworth Farm. That's a lot of cider to be producing 60 years after this was all wilderness. How did you do that? So there's a couple of keys to it. One was, as Ian said, there were definitely health benefits and necessity for doing that because of the lack of potable water. But the other thing was that the people living here at the time, it was interesting. It was most of them came from farms, and there was 200 houses here at that time. There's 800 houses in Cornwall right now. So 200 houses, 1,500 people. There's 7.5 people per house. Obviously, these are large farm families. had a lot of labor and did a lot of things. Also in this, but they knew what they were doing. It wasn't just idle labor. And one thing that also jumped out at me when I read this book, and thanks again for Michael Gannon for transcribing it. It said in here that General Heman Swift, having some time past, purchased and brought from Princess Nursery on Long Island sundry sorts of peaches, pears, plums, and with the Newtown pippin to Cornwall. So then I looked at what is this Prince's Nursery? Well, and it's been great working with Peter, because this is probably one of the premier early nurseries in the United States. It was in business before the Revolutionary War. They did a lot of exporting of rootstock to, especially to Britain, a lot of the conifers and things on the big estates. The British actually protected this nursery during the Revolution. And after the Revolution, when New York was the capital of the United States, the founding fathers were all there. They were all people involved in agriculture. Washington, Jefferson, Adams, Madison all went to this nursery, brought back rootstock to their estates, and planted things, including the Newtown pippin, which we happen to have one of the trees that are highlighted here, the Newtown pippin in his catalog of 1840. These are all trees that we planted on our place, so it's all of a sudden like, really? So Heman Swift, to recap, Heman Swift was bringing rootstock, similar to what we planted in 2024 here, 200 years earlier. So they knew what they were doing, and it's interesting because you look at the amount of trees that they were planting. They knew they were doing a lot of grafting of these things. They knew exactly what they were doing. They had an export market. Apparently Jefferson and Franklin had Newtown pippins shipped over to France and England because they didn't feel there was any fruit over there that was as good as these American apples. And so then now there's a move in New York City 200 years later to make Newtown, which is the old British name for Elmhurst, Queens, where the nursery was, to make this the official apple of New York City. And they're giving this apple out apparently to community gardens up to replant it, even though it's green. It's not a red apple you'll see in New York City a lot. It's the old historic apple, and even Michael Pollan, another Cornwall writer, has been pushing that, knowing the impact this had on the fruit trade and things. So here we have a Cornwall person who was also on Washington's staff during the Revolution, was involved with the founding fathers, and so he's going down the nursery buying this pretty amazing, sorting through some pretty amazing catalog, and this is not one of the earliest catalogs they had. So you get an idea that there was some pretty good, it wasn't just wild trees, they were growing things in a pretty interesting, sophisticated way. It's also interesting, we're here in the Franklin Polly Calhoun room, because Polly Swift Calhoun, and a direct descendant of Heman Swift, who also ties into the story. So you'll see this coming back and forth, all these people intersecting with apples in town. So then, here we go. So then we're looking through these old maps and we say, all right, most of these places had a community cider mill. They made this amount of cider. There was a cider mill right here on Valley Road by, people know as Ann Peterson's house and Birdseye Brook coming through there. There was a sawmill there at the time, but there was also a cider mill there. So that's on an 1850 map. And then, so it was obviously a big thing. I remember hearing from Ralph Scoville. He said that cider, that most farms, back when he was a boy, which was a while ago, filled up their basements with barrels of cider. It was used as a barter commodity. He said that it was used as a barter commodity, and a lot of the stone walls in the town were actually bartered with cider. One story that I also read in the book The Housatonic by Charles Power Smith, who lived here on Jewel Street in the 1940s. he relayed one building that was built on Cider after several tries was the church here, because they relied on some muscle power from the hills, and the muscle power from the hills got into the cider on the first day, and the building didn't go up, so they had to cool it, and then the building finally went up. So, cider was here and doing well, and then they started getting some competition from beer. There was a temperance movement that came up, and there was a slight shift to people going out west. So the town's apple production shifted to more, and also the railroads came in 1840, so people or farms were able to ship apples by barrel, in addition to shipping their milk on the trains. So this is an aerial photo of 1933, right before Prohibition. You'll see those little dots. You can pick it out. This is Cream Hill. This is Cream Hill Farm. And you can see all these dots are apple orchards. So that was a lot of, obviously a lot of production there. And as I said, this story is still being written. Jane came home from a little trip to Delaware with her family and said, "You remember that box of books that Phil Hart gave you?" I said, "Where is it?" She goes, "Under the desk, under the puzzles." So last night we took out these books, which are the Connecticut Agricultural Board, of which T.S. Gold from Cornwall is the secretary, 1872, and Nathan Hart from Cherry Hill is the treasurer, and it recounts how during the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia, Mr. Gold brought down 72 exhibits of apples, and Mr. Hart brought down 31. And that's to Philadelphia, and I believe Mr. Gold won some national prizes for his apples. So it was clear also through the work of this, and T.S. Gold was secretary of this group. They go around to fairs. There was a lot of competitions in the fairs to improve the apple varieties and improve, because there was incredible competition for selling. So there was a lot of effort in introducing new varieties, and also in this book we have record of the Burnham sweet apple, which Michael will talk about, being introduced by T.S. Gold. So again, that just happened last night. We said, what? So, a lot of this stuff, the story's hidden here, but it's here in a book that's 150 years old. So it's really interesting to us, because what we also found was that we can trace some of these apples back in some of these orchards. And Jennifer Marco, when we talk about, we're on the Board of Selectmen together, she talks about the Herbert stripe apple. So we've been on the search for the Herbert stripe apple, which is not a major apple. But we just found mention of the Herbert apple last night in a book as the #3 keeping apple in Connecticut in 1875. So it's got to be here somewhere. It's just out in the woods. So we just got to find it. So that's been part of our mission, is to go out and look in the woods and see what's out there. We've been pretty lucky in finding evidence of trees. We found Baldwins on Rexford Road and up in the Greens on Johnson Road. We've had a lot of support from Phil and Joyce Hart, and found the Maiden Blush tree, which I think has since collapsed. It's one of the several trees that Phil said his grandfather fell out of. But anyway, we have the sign. So he has grafted a lot of these old trees. Interesting one to me personally is the Calhouns have one old tree just right up on the hill there. That was planted by another John Calhoun, John's grandfather. About the same time he gave the town hall. There's one tree remaining. John's daughter Sarah and Ian have grafted trees out of that. So we don't even know what type it is, but we will have a connection. And I think part of this whole thing that's interesting is this connection with the people that may have departed it a while ago, but their apples are still here. They're just waiting to be discovered. Again, we are able to send one of our interesting stories that we've come across. We got to look at the Van Doren tree, which was up on Bradford Road and was here before Mark Van Doren bought his house up there, which John Van Doren owns now. Big tree there, small little yellow apples. So we said, oh, that's unusual. Then we saw one behind Kate Green's house. Said, that's unusual. We saw one at Cherry Hill Farm. That's unusual. Sent up to John Bunker. He said, that's a transcendent crab apple, common in 1800s for farms to have that for jelly and also for cider because of its sugar content. So it was really interesting, and it was introduced by Prince Nursery down on Long Island. So you see all these things sort of tie back together, and was that where all these trees grafted, but it's sort of interesting. You go back in time to Mark Van Doren, Lewis Gannett, whoever, you know, these trees outlived people. So another interesting tree, little grove we found was near, it was in between where the Allen Homestead was on Town Street and the Burnham Homestead on Town Street is the Ives Farm, and we found little trees there. We sent them up to John Bunker, and he said, you've got a Famoose, you've got a St. Lawrence, and a Sopus, which was Jefferson's favorite tree. And those are some of the trees we also had planted before we stumbled on. Somebody planted these right down the road probably 120 years ago. So it's sort of interesting to find out if the grafted trees that we produce are going to be taste the same as the ones from 120 years ago. So anyway, a lot of these keep on returning and returning. And another little historic thing here is Eric Sloane was on the trail. People may know, have heard of him. He was a pretty famous author and illustrator. There's a Sloane Stanley Museum down just across the line in Kent, which has a collection of his tools. Really interesting person, sort of did a lot to preserve early New England folklore, folk life, tools, barn paintings and things. Well, anyway, he wound up talking to somebody in Warren and said, you got to go up on top of Dudleytown. So he wandered up there in 1965. He thinks he found an old apple orchard, which then he made as part of his Reverence for Wood book, which on the cover shows a new apple tree growing from an old tree, which was his theory was these trees actually don't die. They fall over and then they sprout again. So we actually found a Baldwin up at Joe Pryor's house on Rexford Road that had fallen over a couple of times and sprouted, and that's where we took our ciderwood from. So Eric was on the trail up at Dudleytown. We went on the same trail in Dudleytown, did not find anything that looked like an apple tree. Found a little dead apple trees. So it's sort of a Cornwall story that's still being written, and here we are out in the Ives Orchard, and what's really neat there is you can see through the tree, but the tree's still putting out really special apple. Those are unsprayed. My private theory is that's a cow pasture. The cows keep it mowed, keep it fertilized, and it's, you know, waiting for us to come and find it, send it up to Maine to get identified. But there's a St. Lawrence, a very popular dessert apple, came from Canada down here. A lot of these old homesteads would plant an early apple for a summer apple, and then they would have their fall apples, and especially important were the winter keeping apples, like the Herbert, like the Burnham, and like the Baldwin, because you have to go back to before there was Stop and Shop and an endless supply of apples from Washington. So being able to keep these apples through the winter was a huge accomplishment, and people perfected it by a lot of different varieties. So anyway, that's a little bit of what we've learned in the last couple of years of Cornwall's apple history, but it's certainly a rich one, and thank you all for coming to listen.
Really a pleasure to be here and to have such an amazing crowd and to be doing this with the Ridgways. I'm very honored, and I just what they're doing on their farm is just amazing. It's, you know, it's modern, but it's ancient, you know, and somehow they've managed to bring those two things together. So my part of this is I'm going to talk about one apple in Cornwall that I've been working with for about 5 years, actually. And, you know, when I couldn't figure out what it was, my friend John Bunker came to visit me in Cornwall, and I showed him this apple tree. And I said, what do you think it is? And I have no idea. And so it took me about 5 years to figure out what it actually was. So I'm going to tell you the story of how you actually figure out what this stuff is, which is kind of interesting. So this is the tree. We're on Cream Hill Road. This is Bevan's house, as I like to call it. Tommy and Margaret lived there. Well, that's our house. And this tree is in front of the Bevan's house. That's what I meant. And that's the tree. It's got these amazing yellow apples, and you see everything has lost its leaves, but the apples are still on the tree. Now, I came to Cornwall in 1970, and you know, this tree was always it was an amazing tree, but they weren't very good. You know, I tried eating them, and they're bitter, and you know, I just wasn't impressed by it. But nevertheless, I thought it was an interesting tree. And that's the fruit. It's very late in the fall. I remember taking this picture January 27th. They were just falling off the tree. That is really late. That makes this an extremely unusual apple from my understanding, because it holds its apple much longer than any other apples that I was familiar with. And here it is, Christmas 2015. So, you know, this is not random that this tree is there. Somebody must have, you know, put it there for a specific reason. And the fact that it matures, the apple so late, means that they can keep very well. Because if they mature in September, you've got to, you know, they're no good anymore by the time you get to October or November for eating apples. So this is clearly not an eating apple, but what was it? And that was the issue. So here it is. It was a beautiful tree, May and then November 2019, and now I took that picture of last year, 2024. The tree is on its last legs, and so fortunately in 2020, the pandemic was happening, and so my wife Susan and I were staying for the whole summer in Cornwall, and my friend John Bunker came down to visit, and he said, well, you know, why don't you send me some scions and we'll see if we can propagate it. So he did that, and I'll tell you that story a little bit later. And it took us a while, but we finally figured out that the name of that apple is Burnham Sweet. And this is Oliver Burnham's memorial in North Cornwall Cemetery, right on Rattlesnake Road. And what it says there, Oliver Burnham died on April 30th, 1846, aged 86 years. He served his country during the Revolution and contributed largely to maintaining its institutions during his long life. He really was one of Cornwall's most famous residents, wouldn't you say, Gordon? And he was a Revolutionary War veteran. He entered the Revolutionary War at age 15. And that's a whole other story. Maybe we can talk about if we have some extra time.
Defending New York City from the British.
Yeah, there you go. Kind of amazing. And here's this one picture, Gordon. Help me find this picture. Derelict townhouse dwelling of Judge Oliver Burnham. His land in North Cornwall included the town's first stockade, which was sort of like a powder house. Right? Do you want to?
Right across this. I mean, we weren't. You know, this is before my time too. But you know, the Allens were up there, the Burnhams were up here. All these people were in training in the town militia, which also a lot of them had gone, including Swift, had gone up during the French and Indian Wars to Canada. So this wasn't just like a little role playing. This was an active thing. So that when things happened in the Revolution, they were trained.
Yeah, it's an amazing story. Now, he died in, according to the Hartford Chart, 1845, although it says on his gravestone 1846, so we won't worry about that. But, and I'm going to read this last half of it. It is part of his obituary. The deceased belonged to a race of which we have few living examples. Our grandfathers of the Revolution, stern patriots, sincere, rigid in opinion and character, they seem, and then I put this part over there, they seem to have been specially designed by an all-wise providence to oppose that resistance to oppression which was the germ from which has sprung our heaven-watered and wide-spreading tree of civil and religious freedom.
Here, here.
There it is. His obituary. And so the tree that we're going to introduce to you today, this is the first time it's been introduced in the public, is the Burnham Sweet Apple, and it's a symbol of resistance. Perfect. I just love that quote. I couldn't believe it when I found that. So it was originally, though, when Bunker first, after we did it, he said, well, it's called Barnum Sweet. And, based on a Charles Downing, who was the son of A.J. Downing, who was famous landscape from New York State, and across the way wrote a famous book. But it was given that name, and then that mistake was propagated in one of the most recent books, Illustrated History of Apples in the United States and Canada. Barnum, and he sent me a letter, the guy wrote this, and he said, yeah, there's a Barnum family in Litchfield, and it must be named after that. I said, this is a Cornwall apple. Why would you name it after somebody from Litchfield? And then I started thinking, well, maybe it's just a typo, maybe it was really named after Burnham, but I didn't have any evidence for that. So I did a little more work, and then lo and behold, I found this book on the internet. This is of the American Pomological Society held their annual meeting in Boston, and the report from Connecticut by T.S. Gold, West Cornwall, chairman of the State Fruit Committee, of new native varieties of fruit, the Burnham Sweet Apple has been lately brought into notice. It is a yellow apple of large size, keeping well into the winter, and a very fine flavor, is productive. So that's a perfect description of that apple right on Green Hill Road. And it's really Burnham Sweet. It's not Barnum Sweet. So the conclusion is that the correct name, and that Barnum Sweet is what we call in botany an orthographic error. And we're going to correct that. And you're allowed to do that by the rules of nomenclature. If you find a mistake, a spelling mistake, you get to correct it. So we are officially correcting. And John Bunker's going to write a little article about this and publish it so that it becomes an official, as opposed to Barnum Sweet. And, you guys just discovered it last night and gave me a call this morning. They found another book right here, this one, with a reference to Burnham Sweet from 1872. Right. So, this is not something, once you go down this road, it doesn't end. That's the earliest reference to the Burnham Sweet apple. And it's kind of amazing. Now that's I think that's my life. Okay, that's from the book. That's that book. Now I want to say a little bit about T.S. Gold, because he was a part of this. He's the one that essentially, gave it that name and then propagated it and introduced it. So there he is. I don't know if that's on his farm or not. Yes. Freshly picked apples from the farm orchard. There you go. I love that picture. A barrel of apples. And this is the Green Hill Agricultural School, founded in 1845. That's the one with the cupola on the top. But that's the Gold residence that you're all familiar with. Located behind that house that's still there. And it's now located on Kent in the Antique Machinery Museum. It's amazing to go there. If you haven't been there, it's really worth it. And I love this picture of the Cream Hill students. This montage. You see T.S. Gold and Samuel Gold with the beards and those student families. It's not an actual photograph, it's a collage. And this is the thing from the book that Gordon mentioned, Cornwall 1801. I found in one of the footnotes in the very back, it took me a long time to find it, he quoted Oliver Burnham in 1812, the statement, "Cider is made in sufficient quantities and much is distilled." This is the part I like. "No grain of consequence is tortured in this way or lost to the world by distillation." In other words, we're not wasting grain by fermenting it and creating, you know, alcohol. You should make alcohol out of apples. And I think that is really the lesson of today. And then just to end with, this is, John Bunker Ian mentioned him. He sent me this email. "Today we headed south to Boston with 27 2-year-old Burnham Sweet apple trees. Burnham Sweet is an old heirloom winter-keeping apple. It was introduced to us by Peter Tredici, the Arboretum, a summer resident of Cornwall. Peter was able to find 1 or 2 puny cyanwood sticks from the ancient trade and sent them to us in 2020. From those we were able to graft 1 tree. That tree produced the cyanwood we use for 27 trees. And we dropped the trees off with Peter. We'll take it back to Cornwall and they'll be sold as a fundraiser. The project will raise awareness of local historic agriculture, save another rare variety, reintroduce it to its town of origin, and raise funds to support the library. Meanwhile, the old Cornwall tree has broken apart and won't be around much longer. Another victory for historic apple presentation." So there you have it. This is the first and only introduction of the Burnham Sweet apple. Now I do have to say, it's not an eating out of hand apple. It's a cider apple. So, you know, don't buy it thinking you're going to have this wonderful, tasty apple.
Make tarts.
It's actually good for cooking. It's a baking apple. And so, let me ask you, so I came down with 27 apples, but the Ridgways bought 5 of them for their orchard, and then I donated 1 to the Cornwall Historical Society, and 1 was
Right, it's in the ground now growing.
it is, and 1 to John Bevins, the family. And then you tell me you got rid of 3 today.
Well, there's people here that want it.
So we have 17 left.
A question, point of question. Is the word "sweet" in the name of the apple, is that an ironic use of the word?
I don't know the answer to that.
When you wait long enough and the apples get really dark yellow, I have found them to be sweet in late fall. But if you eat them in August or September, they're not sweet.
I don't know, it sounds like marketing to me.
Yeah, the old day, they just, by the rules of nomenclature, you just call it, they don't like adjectives as part of the name, so we just call it Burnham. And, but I like the word sweet as part of it. So let me just say now, so we only have 17 apples left. And because this is really a fundraiser, you know, if you buy them, you know, wholesale from them, I pay $30 a piece. But I think that as a fundraiser, I'd like to offer them to anybody who wants one, up to 17, for $75. And, you know, I will take that money, give it to the library, once I pay myself back. So the question is, are there more than 17 people that want to, raise your hand if you're interested in an apple. Oh, great, at $75 each. So I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, so about 10 or 11, okay. Oh, good, so we don't have to fight about it. We don't have to draw names out of a hat. Okay. Maybe you want to add anything, Gordon?
We do have a little cider we brought down.
Tasting.
Tasting. And if there's any questions?
Oh yeah, let's take some questions and then we'll get together and you can do Venmo or write a check and do the apple. We'll do the tasting. Yes.
When you graft vines, winemaking vines, it's because they're protected by the root. Okay, part of the vine is
Yeah, these are on standard rootstock, so they'll be a full-size tree.
why are they grafted?
Oh, because you can't root them from cuttings. And so this is clonal propagation. Now, Ian mentioned that, the seedling apples are highly variable. The thing about the apple, it originated in Kazakhstan as a wild tree dispersed by horses, wild horses, and then it made its way to Europe somehow or other, and it was hybridized in Europe with the European species, and that's the origin of the domesticated apple. And the fact that there's so much variation that you see when you grow from seed, that proves it's a domesticated plant, because if it was a wild tree, it would be a species and it would reproduce itself from seed. So it's been totally hybridized, and so every seedling is going to be different because it's not a wild species. So this is, the history that we're dealing with.
What rootstock did they use?
Standard, full size.
Oh, but I mean, what specific apple?
Oh, I don't know.
Oh, does it matter?
Yeah.
I mean, does it even matter?
No.
No, okay.
It's from Maine, so they're super hardy, okay? It's not from the Pacific Coast or something like that. These are designed to be grown.
Even grow in East Cornwall on Green Hill.
Yes, definitely can. It can grow on Cream Hill Road. Anywhere in Cornwall. Yes.
I have a question for Ian.
Yes.
So cider is not, you can't make cider out of pasteurized cider, is that correct?
Yeah, so the pasteurization process will kill off the yeast that occurs, so you'll have to add yeast. You can still use it, but you have to add yeast back into it. So when you sterilize it like that, then that ambient yeast that collects naturally will be killed off.
So are you saying that the yeast and the fermentation kind of sterilizes it?
No, as it ferments, it will sterilize, but if you're using cider that's been pasteurized, and you try to just ferment it like that and let it go, it's not going to ferment, most likely, because it won't have that yeast in there that starts the fermentation process.
In fact, that's why the alcohol level stops at a certain percentage, because it actually kills the yeast.
Okay.
And that is one of the things that, I don't know if you mentioned this, but one of the things that made cider so popular was that it was relatively clean compared to the water. So drinking water in those days was risky, no sanitation, and but drinking cider, because of the alcohol content, was considered safe, and even young children would drink cider. Everybody drank it.
No drinking age.
I have another question. Was there any history of making harder, higher proof alcohol, like I think what was known as Apple Jack, with the same apples?
So the thing I found, and it wasn't Cornwall specific, but if you freeze cider, then it'll be concentrated. So what's going to thaw first is like the water is going to stay frozen longest. So all the sugar and the alcohol, so you can make cider before you ferment it, freeze it, and then like thaw it out halfway, and you're going to have a higher sugar concentration in that. And then if you just ferment that, you're going to get a higher alcohol content. I'm not sure you're going to get like 50%, but you could probably get like 20 or...
It's kind of like making maple syrup. You're taking the water out.
Ice
cider,
Then there is record of apple brandy being a huge industry in Connecticut in the mid-1800s. So they went from cider into distilling into apple brandy. There were 2 distilleries. There was apparently 1 or 2 in Cornwall. There were several in Torrington. So that was the next thing. And there is someone who named anonymous in Cornwall that takes their cider to Litchfield Distillery to make brandy. So
oh, really? And
still
wasn't there
down.
some other danger too, some health hazard that something can go wrong and you can get like, wood alcohol or something that's going to make you crazy?
You're still, like if you're really using it still, there's definitely going to be inherent risk to that.
Yeah.
If you're dealing with really high alcohol.
I can remember another story from Ralph Scovel said that some of the alcohol products that they distilled could actually pick you up and drop you in the corner. So it didn't sound like something that would
Yeah, I talked to one guy who was distilling apple Jack, and he said if it looked the wrong color, he just put it in his lawnmower and didn't start the lawnmower.
Biofuel, I like it.
Yeah, Jeremy.
What was the legal status of all this wild home or farm produced alcohol? Was there any regulation of it? Was there revenuers coming around to Cornwall with pickups?
Taxation?
That's a good question. I think because so much of it was like basically a home brew, you're not trying to really sell it. I haven't really dug into it too much, but I think it was pretty relaxed, at least for the first while anyway. It was just sort of standard practice in society, you know. And people like even at the tavern, so they weren't like going there to like get hammered. They were going there to be social, and they just happened to have cider there, and it was fun. But it wasn't like trying to drink yourself under the bar or anything.
So this particular cider that we brought is a home brew. It is not licensed yet. But
At your own risk.
to be totally correct, it does come from our friend Mike Carano's orchard on Swiftbridge Road. Just go figure. So these are Cornwall apples made into cider.
Is it all the same cider or?
Yeah, I just reused some bottles.
Oh, okay, so it's all.
Recycling.
Yeah, recycled.
Phil, did you have a question?
Yes, do apple trees bear fruit every year?
Every other year usually, or I don't know about the wild ones, so
I think if they're naturally left to their own devices, sometimes they will get themselves into a more biannual cropping where they really put out a lot of fruit and then they have a down year. But there are ways you can prune an apple tree to try to avoid that and get a more reliable crop.
It's interesting because in these books that we've been reading from T.S. Gold, he talks about the Baldwin being a huge, important apple crop, and there were definitely on years and off years, but there's ways you could prune in an off year to keep the production up. And what's interesting, one of the trees that we planted 20 years ago is called Liberty, and that had a really good apple crop last year, and this year it's covered with blossoms. So but a lot of trees will take the year off after a heavy year.
Because last year was huge apple blossom, and this year, if you look now, it's not nearly.
that's normal. I mean, the trees, they put all the energy to root the apples, and they take a rest, they rebuild their resources, and then so that's the natural alternate year.
All fruit, Peter?
Pretty much trees, very much trees, seed production. It's not like acorns. You have a good mass year, every 4 or 5 years, they produce a ton of acorns. You know, they have to rebuild. And so apples or fruit trees are biennial, or, usually.
This may be a really stupid question, but you mentioned it took 5 years to identify one particular species, and you also mentioned at one point a couple of sticks were used and sent out to
propagate it, yeah.
But how do they determine what the species is? I mean, is there such a thing as apple DNA?
Well, that is going to do that next. So once you can't, it's like a dog. They're hybrids, so they're not purebred strains, so you can't just get a DNA result and identify it based on that. So he knew it was a yellow apple and it was from Cornwall, and just searching with those, he came up with this Barnum as an apple. Now, he's going to do the DNA work and see who the ancestors of it were, but you can't, because they're hybrids, you can't identify down to the cultivar level. That's the individual. That's a cultivar. It's that's like Ian, Gordon, and me. We're each a different clone. And you can't say what a clone is. It's really hard.
Did I read that there?
How do they get the DNA? It can't spit into a vial.
Oh, any piece of tissue. The leaf is young leaves early in the spring. That's the best.
And you can determine what the DNA is from that.
I have a related question about identification, because once you get fruit, I guess you can look at the apple.
Yes, absolutely. And the old books are
but
all.
Can someone like John Bunker or some of you guys identify them from the wood? Because otherwise you have to wait till the apple fruits.
Yeah.
I found apple trees on our property, but they don't fruit. And so
just doing it from the DNA is hard because they're hybrids, so you can't really,
Yeah, I think it's real. I'm still very much a novice. I feel like that's definitely a green apple. That one looks more red. That's sort of but talking to Bunker, he has sort of like a methodology where you first look for a graft union, because a lot of times you can tell, even if it's a massive tree, the rootstock will either be bigger or smaller, so you have some sort of bulb around the base of the tree. And then through that, he can say this is probably 50 years old or 70 years old. And then like he did for this tree, he was like, all right, where are we regionally? And like what, they gotta help you on yellow fruit, but he could say, what can I find in New England for the time frame for a catalog? And you can narrow it down to be like, all right, like a Macintosh wasn't around until the 19th, like it's not gonna be that. But maybe he could on some trees grow certain ways, but I don't know. I think it's really hard to.
Well, he used the fact that it was from Cornwall.
Yeah.
We figured, he had never seen an apple like this, so he said this must be a local apple. So he and his friend, they just searched, apple at Cornwall, and that comes up with possibilities. But Jane in the back.
Biologically, why can't you tell DNA from a hybrid? What is different?
Well, what I mean is that, because it's like a dog, you have all these breeds of dogs, but they're not purebred, they're all hybrids, basically. So you can't, it's very hard.
But it's DNA, even if it's a hybrid, right?
Yeah, but it would be like the difference between all of us.
I mean,
you can establish us as all being Homo sapiens.
Some of us are.
So you can identify a species.
Right, but beyond that, you can't really.
You can't get down to the individual level with DNA unless you have a huge database. So you can tell, like wild plants, you can take a DNA sample and you can identify it. But hybrids, you can't tell what it is. And you've got to identify to the clonal level, to the individual level. That's really hard to do. So you can take a Macintosh apple, and you know what a Macintosh looks like, and you can see does anything match a Macintosh.
Well, so not to be a doubter then, have any of these descendants of the Scionwood grown yellow apples that match the...
We don't know yet. None of them have flowered.
All right. Just keep that in mind as bidding.
Well, they take 3 years, 3 or 4 years.
So
Yeah.
2 years now?
Yeah.
So at 5 years they'll produce, or at 3 years?
Probably between 3 and 5 years, I planted, it all depends, it's hard to know with this variety. There's some trees I planted and I pick fruit off of them in a year, which is like very little crafts. But then most within 3 years you should get a couple apples, and then by 5 years. But it depends, there's some varieties where it's like people are waiting 10 years and it's like, come on. So with this, we're all in it together, I don't know. So.
Our only hint is, just with our limited experience, if you want something that's quick, we planted the Wixton crabapple, which has an incredible taste, and that's producing after 2 years, and it's a really interesting apple, and it's really good for cider, but it's also a really interesting taste. It doesn't taste like your store-bought apple. So if you want a quick to balance out, maybe it's Mr. Slow or Mr. Take His Time, go for Wixton. There's ways to balance that out.
So you're ready for our tasting? One more question, and we're ready for the cider tasting. All right. Well, thank you very much.